Finovate showcases cutting-edge banking and financial technology through a global conference series featuring short-form demos and thought leadership. Now, the conversation continues on the Finovate podcast.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Finovate podcast. We've got a fun one for you today. I am chatting with Rory Tanner, Head of UK Government Affairs and Public Policy at Revolut. Rory will actually be joining us for a panel at FinovateEurope, which is coming up on the 25th and 26th of February at the Intercontinental O2 in London. And we're going to give a little preview of what he's going to be talking about there, as well as get into some other topics and what 2025 is going to look like. Rory, thank you so much for taking the time to connect with me here today.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
So before we get into the meat of it, let's start by having you just give a quick introduction. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your role at Revolut.
Sure. So I'm Head of UK Government Affairs and Public Policy. So that's essentially two roles. So firstly, I lead our UK engagement with government, parliament and industry. So looking at achieving positive policy, regulatory and business outcomes and managing those relationships with ministers, with civil servants and key regulators. The other part is public policy, so looking at these future issues, so whether it be legislation, regulation, and looking to shape those to support Revolut's business opportunities. So really what we do is trying to shape future policy and regulation to drive innovation and support growth, both of Revolut and the UK economy.
Yeah, it's a big job, or maybe a big two jobs, as it were. I also wanted to just ask, because I saw in your bio that you gave us for FinovateEurope, it looks like you spent some time in the House of Commons. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing there, how long ago that was?
Yes, so I started my career there. So I graduated in 2016 and then went straight in and worked in Parliament for 2 years. So I worked as a parliamentary assistant, so working with MPs in their Westminster office, supporting their Westminster activity. So I worked for two separate MPs in that period. And, you know, it's a very interesting time in politics. It was just after the Brexit vote. I think I joined the day that David Cameron left Parliament. So it was quite a volatile time. And, you know, there was a lot of disagreements around, you know, how we were going to deliver Brexit. And so, you know, it was super interesting because it was kind of a lot of history happening, history of the capital H, but at the same time, you know, there was a lot of tension. There was a general election, there was a terrorist attack, there was massive opposition within the Conservative Party, within Labour. And so it was quite an eye-opening time. I always say, like, I really saw how the sausages were made of politics. But, you know, in terms of a career in public affairs and policy, I think it's the best place to start your career.
Yeah, well, and we won't get too far into the causation versus correlation debate, whether or not, you know, your first day at Cameron's last day. I don't know if you drove him out, but we'll leave that for other people to decide. So, you know, at FinovateEurope, you're going to be joining us for a panel that's going to talk about neobanks and what's coming up in that space over the course of the next year plus. Before we dive into that, I want to just get your high-level thoughts on what's coming up in 2025. What are you focusing on right now this coming year? Or maybe put another way, where are you seeing the biggest opportunities coming from?
Yeah, so I could probably break it down to three key areas for Revolut and my position as Head of UK Government Affairs. So firstly, looking at Revolut becoming a bank in the UK, so exiting AWR, supporting that process from a UK government, parliament and industry perspective, and then really looking about how Revolut can graduate from being an account that people have to being a primary bank for our users. So using us for all of their banking services, not just when they go on holiday or when they send money abroad. Secondly is looking at fraud prevention. So a really important issue within the UK and looking about how we can improve fraud prevention and collaborate with government, with industry, with tech firms, with telcos around, you know, really introducing cross-sector data sharing and more regulatory alignment to ensure that we really tackle this, you know, scourge on our society. And then thirdly, looking at the UK's position as a leader within payments innovation. So there's a massive amount of opportunity for Revolut and the UK economy in terms of looking at open banking and the applications of commercial VRPs for e-commerce, looking at leveraging the data bill that's going through Parliament at the moment to create open finance, which would introduce the principles of open banking into areas such as credit, insurance, pensions, investments, which is a massive opportunity. Looking at cross-border payments and how we're going to approach the costs of those. And then finally, crypto asset regulation. So, looking at the FCA's roadmap for that, and then considering how we're going to regulate stablecoins and CBDCs in the future. So a lot there, but really interesting stuff, at least for me, which is a bit of a policy geek.
Yeah, no, certainly a lot of interesting things, I think, for anybody in the fintech space. And 2025 is looking like it's going to be a very big year in a number of areas. I want to jump in a little bit more deeply on the cryptocurrency side of things, because I think this is an area where obviously there's going to be different regulatory environments in the UK and in the US. We're seeing this market surge right now in terms of the prices of all these crypto assets. Is this the usual volatility, kind of business as usual in the crypto space, or is there something more sustainable that's driving these rising prices?
So I think if you look at Bitcoin specifically, it seems to me that the most recent surge in Bitcoin is linked to Trump being elected, the signals that we're getting within the SEC that there's going to be more crypto-friendly regulators, and then with this new Congress, a majority of congressmen and women that are seen as pro-crypto. So I think within the US, there's definitely a really positive surge there that is linked to that. And I think it's a very US-centric position that has led to that surge. I think when you consider Bitcoin and crypto assets, that the lack of regulatory frameworks would always usually mean that the volatility is more aggressive. And that goes both ways, right? Both in the surge and when you saw some of that, the collapse of FTX, that crypto winter, I think that the regulatory framework or the lack of it really, really contributed to the volatility of that. But I think what this clearly shows is that it's become too big of an issue for policymakers to ignore, both in terms of like the customer ownership and the US political direction and, overt political support that it has. I would say, again, I mentioned that was a US-centric approach. From a UK perspective, I think it's certainly more nuanced, that the overt enthusiasm probably hasn't been reflected either in UK policymakers or in the regulatory frameworks. When you consider the UK, actually, probably some of the more interesting pieces are around looking at tokenized assets more than, Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those other crypto assets. From my perspective, looking at Revolut, some of the more interesting pieces is how the UK is going to approach stablecoin regulation now that MiCA is live in the EU, and that Tether, which is the dollar backed stablecoin, is not regulatory approved for the EU. So there's an opportunity for a non-dollar based stablecoin to emerge. And the question that I'm asking is there an opportunity for the UK or for sterling within that? And then also the Bank of England has outlined that it's likely to make its decision in 2025 around whether it would introduce a CBDC, central bank digital currency. Again, a really interesting opportunity for Revolut and for the UK economy. It seems to me that regulators have been told by the Treasury, by the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, to focus more on growth and competitiveness. And they are looking at ways in which they can actually deliver that, because they are not commercial institutions. So it's a little bit more difficult to do that. But I think that crypto assets and the pieces within that are one of the avenues that they're exploring to execute that. And I think that that's a positive signal.
Yeah, no, a lot to unpack there, and a lot of things where we're still sort of in this wait and see mode. We don't know at this point exactly what the Trump administration is going to do, although, as you say, there are some early indications of what their priorities are going to be. We're waiting on some decisions from various regulatory agencies and strategists in the UK side as well. So, a lot of interesting pieces to juggle there. One thing that's, I think, easy to say is that it's getting more and more mainstream coverage, which is a really interesting thing, given crypto's kind of origin as being well outside of the mainstream, as almost a rejection of traditional banking. And now it's kind of seeking this banking approval from these big players, which is going to be just fascinating to watch. Outside of the crypto space, are there other governmental or regulatory shifts that you're seeing or you think are likely to occur in 2025 that could have a big impact on Revolut?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned fraud prevention earlier. One of the things that we've seen in the last 24 hours. Maybe it kind of signals when we're recording this, but we saw very recently that Meta has outlined that it's no longer going to be doing content moderation on its platform. And, this is quite a seismic shift in terms of how it's approaching content on its platform. We were also seeing Nick Clegg leaving and Joel Kaplan taking his place, which suggests to me personally that Meta sees its regulatory risk in the US now, not in the UK or the EU. And, it seems quite an obvious signal that that's with Trump coming back into the White House. We're also seeing, Elon Musk being publicly critical of UK government decisions. And I guess the way that we look at it from Revolut's perspective is around fraud prevention, that in the UK, almost the majority of fraud is enabled by a handful of big tech organizations where scammers are using their platforms to target and scam victims for fraud. Now, there's a lot of work going on around, proactive data sharing and other pieces to improve fraud prevention. But what we're considering is that if these big tech firms are raising the drawbridge around content moderation, what does that mean for proactive fraud prevention? And I think that's a concern for us and something that we need to really watch and see. And then perhaps a more speculative point, but another one to consider is that the UK government and the regulators such as Ofcom do have opportunities to issue fines or big warnings to these firms. And the question I'm considering is, how will the UK government respond if, let's say, Ofcom issues a fine to an American big tech firm? If Trump or Musk or one of these firms reacts aggressively, unconventionally, maybe even undiplomatically, how will quite a new government approach that? And, it's a new area that I think this government is unaware of, and it's going to be an unpredictable time. And I think ultimately we're concerned about how that is going to impact fraud prevention, because ultimately we need collaboration from these firms, because they are enabling the fraud, and we need to work with them to help solve the issue, and we're not going to do it without them. So I think it's a concern for us at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's easy to see. And I think, again, there's a lot that we have to keep our eye on, and a lot of speculation still, but I think it's, it's starting to take shape. It's starting to, this image of what the future could look like is starting to gel. And I think it's going to be clear that there's a lot that's going to happen in 2025. And there's going to be a lot of ways the industry is going to have to respond to this. And right now, this wait and see point is always a little bit difficult. But some of the early signs are there, and it's a good time to start planning. So looking now at kind of the topic of the panel that you'll be on when you join us at the Intercontinental in a little bit more than a month, obviously that's going to be about neobanks specifically. We'll try and save a lot of the good stuff for that panel itself. But I think one question that is worth getting into at this point is, we started to see this two sides of the coin. Some neobanks have gone on to be very successful, and some of them have kind of quietly fizzled out. What do you think has allowed some neobanks to grow so substantially while others have struggled?
So I think one of the main contentions that I would push back against is the stickiness of banking services. Especially in the UK, the argument always is that a bank's a bit like a football team. You get given one by your parents at birth, and you stick with it for the rest of your life. And I certainly think that that's true, right? When you're growing up or when you become a teenager, you're usually given a bank, and for a lot of people, that's just the one you stick with, right? So that's one truth. But then from my perspective, and I kind of speak on behalf of a millennial, I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but what I do think is that we have seen massive disruptions via technology, and new apps emerge and become the mainstream, and that's not a controversial thing. So if you think about social media, we've gone from Bebo to Facebook to Instagram to TikTok. So why not a bank move from a traditional high street bank to a Revolut? For us, that's not a controversial thing. It's almost like the winner takes all in terms of what offers the best product. And I think ultimately that's what the neobanks have done. If you look at how Revolut has grown, or Monzo or Starling, you look at the market failures that we addressed, that people were getting ripped off when they were sending money abroad, or when they wanted to use their card abroad, or when they wanted to take money out of cash machines. And these firms emerge and offer a solution that is, better than what the market is offering. And you've seen the rise of these neobanks because they've solved market failures, combined with, very, very high UX and nice UI, which, for a younger generation that is on their phone constantly, competes with them using Instagram or Uber or any of these other Silicon Valley based apps. And I think that, that has allowed these banks and fintechs to emerge. And you probably are right that it's not that widespread, right? When you think about the winners, it's kind of, 4 or 5 banks and fintechs that have emerged. And again, I just don't want to say that Revolut's better than all of them, which maybe but I think there's an element of truth that while there is opportunities for disruption, it's still a very congested space. That if you have a Revolut account, or if you have a Monzo or Starling, you're unlikely to have 3 or 4, like you just have one. So I think that when these kind of winners emerge through word of mouth, that helps. And now you see Revolut, Monzo, Starling, Wise all doing big marketing campaigns. I was watching the football the other day, and Revolut and Monzo had adverts, on Sky Sports. So, it kind of reaches a point that to reach that kind of, tens of millions of customers base, you do need to act a bit like an incumbent in that sense. And that's probably why you've got there. I don't want to start commenting about why other firms haven't been as successful, but I think you can kind of see what the successful ones have done to reach the position that they have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, to your point, coming back to finding an opportunity, finding a customer segment that's not being served, or a way that you can give somebody something that they didn't have before, is obviously really crucial. And then the challenge becomes, like you talked about at the very beginning, how do you go from being, a service provider, somebody who you engage with when you have a specific need, when you're going on holiday, for example, to being kind of that primary financial institution. And that's really the critical line to get across, as you mentioned right out of the gate. That's one of your primary focuses for this year. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how you're able to, how Revolut and others are able to kind of try and cross that threshold. But certainly coming into it with a strong UX, a strong idea of what your customers actually want, has been a massive benefit. And you can see that being borne out. So we're at the end of our time here, but I just want to quickly ask you, looking ahead at the panel that you'll be on, you've got some really cool fellow panelists who'll be joining. We've got Jordan Sinclair from Robinhood, Valentina Christensen of Oak North, and of course our moderator, Ross Gallagher of 11FS. Whose perspective are you most curious to hear about when you think about coming into that panel?
I'll probably have to go Jordan and Valentina, because they're both competitors and I want to steal all of their ideas. So.
I'm sure they'll come into it with a similar type of, it should be an interesting one, I suppose. Ross will have his work cut out for him to keep you guys all on task. Well, Rory, I want to thank you again for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you in person when we get to Finovate Europe. And yeah, appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
The Finovate podcast is produced by Informa Connect in association with Provoke.fm Media. Check out Finovate.com for information on Finovate's upcoming shows and to learn how you can get involved. The discount code Finovate Podcast will save you 20% on tickets to all of our events. And you can email us at info@Finovate.com for information on sponsoring, speaking, or demoing. Thanks for listening.